When I saw the old veteran whose family had abandoned him, even his own daughter said, "He's not a soldier anymore. He's a burden." I decided to help him. But back then, I had no idea who he really was. Look, I never planned to become some kind of saint or anything. I was just a regular guy working at Home Depot, living paycheck to paycheck like most Americans, when my buddy Mike convinced me to volunteer at the VA center downtown. He said they needed people to drive veterans to appointments, help with paperwork, basic stuff. I figured why not? My dad served in Vietnam, and I always felt guilty I never did anything to help vets myself. That's how I met Arlen J. Rhodes in the spring of 2019. This old guy, 97 years old, sitting alone in the corner of the waiting room every Tuesday like clockwork. While other veterans had family members with them, Arlen always came alone. The first time I saw him, he was wearing this faded 82nd Airborne cap and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. His hand shook a little when he filled out forms, but his eyes were sharp as hell. The volunteer coordinator, Janet, pulled me aside one day and asked if I could be Arlen's regular driver. She explained that his family situation was complicated. That's how she put it, complicated. I said sure. How hard could it be to drive an old man to doctor appointments? Boy, was I wrong about the simple part. The first few rides were pretty quiet. Arlen would give me the address. I'd drive. He'd go to his appointment, and I'd drive him home to this tiny apartment in a rundown complex on the east side of town. But after about a month, he started opening up, started with small talk about the weather, then moved complaining about his doctors, and eventually to stories about the war. This wasn't just any war veteran. This guy had been at D-Day. Not just anywhere on D-Day. He was part of the 82nd Airborne that jumped behind enemy lines in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944. He talked about floating down in his parachute in complete darkness, not knowing if he'd land in a field or on a German bayonet. What struck me most was how detailed his memories were. At 97, Arlen could tell you exactly what the French countryside smelled like that morning, could describe the face of every guy in his unit, could walk you through battle tactics like he was still planning them. His mind was razor sharp, which made what I was about to learn about his family situation even more messed up. I met his daughter Sarah exactly once during those early months, and it was by accident. I was dropping Arlen off after a particularly long day at the VA. He'd had to see 3 different specialists, and this woman in her 60s was standing outside his apartment building, smoking a cigarette and looking annoyed. She introduced herself and immediately started complaining about how I was wasting my time with her father. Apparently, she thought he should be in a nursing home, but Arlen refused to go. She looked me up and down like I was some kind of scam artist and said something I'll never forget. He's not a soldier anymore. He's just a burden. The war was 80 years ago. It's time to move on. I wanted to say something, but Arlen put his hand on my arm and shook his head slightly. We went upstairs to his apartment, and he made us both coffee in these old ceramic mugs that probably came from the 1970s. That's when he started telling me the real story about his family. Sarah wasn't his biological daughter. After the war, Arlen had married a widow named Betty, who had a young daughter from her first marriage. Arlen adopted Sarah, raised her as his own, put her through college, walked her down the aisle at her wedding. Betty died 15 years ago, and ever since then, Sarah had been trying to get Arlen declared incompetent so she could sell his apartment and put him in the cheapest nursing home she could find. The neighbors weren't much better. Mrs. Henderson from across the hall actually asked me once if Arlen was dangerous, if his war stories meant he had PTSD or something. She said it with this concerned voice, but I could tell she just wanted me to confirm her suspicions so she'd have an excuse to complain to the building manager, another neighbor. This guy, who looked like he'd never worked a day in his life, suggested that maybe old veterans like Arlen should just keep their war stories to themselves because they made people uncomfortable. He said this while we were waiting for the elevator, like Arlen wasn't standing right there. The old man just smiled and nodded, but I could see it hurt him. I started spending more time with Arlen outside, of just driving him places. We'd grab lunch at this diner that gave veterans a discount, or I'd help him organize his medications, or we'd just sit in his living room and talk. His apartment was like a small museum. photos from the war, his dress uniform hanging in a plastic bag, medals in a shadow box that needed dusting. But the most interesting thing was this black leather notebook he always kept on his coffee table. It was beat up, with the 82nd Airborne insignia barely visible on the cover. Whenever we talk about the war, he'd flip through pages in that notebook, referencing dates and names and places. He treated that thing like it was made of gold. I asked him about it once, and he got this distant look in his eyes. He said it contained everything important from his service, not just the battles and the friends he lost, but other things too. Things he'd never told anyone, not even Betty. He'd started writing in it during the war and never stopped. Sometimes when we were having coffee, Arlen would get the serious expression and start flipping to the notebook, muttering to himself about coordinates and landmarks. When I'd ask what he was looking at, he'd just smile and change the subject. It was like he was carrying around some kind of secret that he wasn't ready to share. The guy had survived one of the bloodiest campaigns in World War II, raised a daughter who now treated him like garbage, and lived alone in a crummy apartment where nobody wanted to hear his stories. But somehow, he still had this dignity about him, this quiet strength that made you want to listen when he talked. One afternoon in late summer, we were sitting in his living room after another doctor's visit. His arthritis was acting up, but otherwise he was healthy as a horse, when Arlen got unusually quiet. He was holding that black notebook in his lap, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. He looked at me with those sharp blue eyes and said something that didn't make complete sense at the time, but stuck with me anyway. He said that if anything ever happened to him, if his family came around asking questions or trying to go through his things, there was something important I should know about, something in that notebook that nobody else would understand or appreciate. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and smiled. Classic Arlen. Drop a mysterious comment and then act like nothing happened. He got out to make more coffee and started telling me about this time his unit got lost behind enemy lines for 3 days, living off of rainwater and stolen German rations. But I kept thinking about what he'd said, about something in that notebook that his family wouldn't understand. The way he'd said it, with such certainty that they wouldn't care, made me realize just how alone this old warrior really was. Here was a guy who'd risked his life for his country, who'd helped liberate Europe from fascism, and his own daughter couldn't be bothered to visit him more than once every few months. The more time I spent with Arlen, the more I understood why he treasured that notebook so much. It wasn't just a record of his service. It was proof that his life had meant something, that he'd been part of something bigger than himself. In a world where everyone seemed to have forgotten his sacrifices, that notebook was his anchor to a time when he'd mattered. Little did I know that Arlen's cryptic comment about the notebook would soon become the most important conversation we'd ever had. But for now, I was just happy to be the one person in his life who actually wanted to listen to his stories, who understood that this wasn't some old man rambling about ancient history. This was living history, sitting right there in a faded flannel shirt, asking nothing more than for someone to remember. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 months after that conversation about the notebook. It was Rosa, the building manager, and her voice was shaking. Arlen had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His heart finally gave out, just like that. The coroner said it was quick, no suffering, exactly how the old soldier would have wanted it. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. Sure, Arlen was 97, and I knew this day would come eventually, but you're never really prepared to lose someone who's become such a big part of your life. This man had survived D-Day, lived through nearly a century of American history, and now he was gone. Sarah showed up at the apartment building about 3 hours after Rosa called her. She arrived with her husband Tom and their teenage son. I think his name was Kyle, though he never spoke a word during the entire time I knew him. The first thing Sarah said when she saw me wasn't condolences or how sorry she was about her father. It was asking when they could start clearing out the apartment, because the lease needed to be terminated by the end of the month. I offered to help with funeral arrangements, thinking maybe this would be when the family finally showed Arlen some respect. Boy, was I wrong. Sarah chose the cheapest package at the cheapest funeral home in town. No military honors, no flag ceremony, no honor guard, just a basic service that lasted maybe 25 minutes in a room that smelled like cheap air freshener. When I suggested that Arlen had earned a proper military funeral, that the VA would provide honors for free, Sarah actually rolled her eyes. She said they didn't have time for all that pageantry, that it wouldn't bring him back anyway. Her husband, Tom, nodded along like a bobblehead, and their son just stared at his phone the entire time. The funeral itself was depressing as hell. Besides Sarah's family and me, there were maybe 6 other people there, a couple of neighbors who felt obligated to show up, and 2 guys from the American Legion who'd heard about it through the grapevine. When the funeral director asked if anyone wanted to say a few words, Sarah shook her head and said they just wanted to get through it. So I stood up and talked about Arlen for maybe 5 minutes. I told him about his service, about D-Day, about how sharp his mind was right up until the end. I mentioned how he'd raised Sarah as his own daughter, how he'd worked 2 jobs to put her through college, how proud he was of his family even though they rarely visited. Sarah spent the entire time looking at her watch. After the service, we went to the cemetery for the burial. It was one of those massive suburban graveyards where the headstones all look the same, and you need a map to find anything. Sarah had chosen a plot in the back corner, as far from the main road as possible. No military section, no veterans area, just a random spot where land was cheapest. That's when something unexpected happened. 2 soldiers in dress uniforms showed up right as they were lowering the casket. Turned out the American Legion guys had made some calls, and these soldiers came on their own time to give Arlen a proper send-off. They folded an American flag and presented it to Sarah, then fired a 3-volley salute that echoed across the entire cemetery. For a moment, just a moment, I thought maybe Sarah would finally understand what her father had been. But she just stood there looking annoyed, like these soldiers were putting on some kind of show that was keeping her from getting back to her car. Her husband kept checking his phone, and their son had his earbuds in, completely tuned out. After everyone left, Sarah approached me in the parking lot. She said they needed to clean out Arlen's apartment over the weekend, and asked if I wanted any of his old military stuff. She said it with this dismissive tone, like she was offering me garbage that she didn't want to deal with. She literally used the words, old junk, when referring to her father's war memorabilia. I told her I'd be honored to take some of his things, especially anything related to his service. Sarah waved her hand and said I could have whatever I wanted. They were just going to donate everything to Goodwill anyway. She mentioned that Tom had already called a junk removal service for the following Monday. That Saturday morning, I met them at Arlen's apartment. Sarah and Tom were focused on anything that might have monetary value, checking drawers for cash, looking through papers for bank accounts or insurance policies. Kyle was sitting on the couch playing video games on his phone, completely uninterested in his grandfather's life. I went straight to Arlen's bedroom and found that black leather notebook exactly where he'd told me it would be, on the top shelf of his closet, wrapped in an old pillowcase that smelled like Old Spice aftershave. My hands were shaking as I unwrapped it, remembering all those times I'd seen him flip through its pages. The notebook was even more detailed than I'd imagined. Page after page of careful handwriting, documenting everything from battle positions to the names of French families who'd helped his unit. There were sketches of landscapes, copies of letters he'd sent home, even pressed flowers from European battlefields. But it was page 47 that stopped me cold. There, in Arlen's precise handwriting, was an entry dated September 15th, 1945. It read, after returning from service, I buried a tin box on the old farm property in West Virginia, near the lightning split oak tree. Inside are my medals, some rare stamps I collected during the war, and a portion of gold I acquired in Germany. I didn't know how to properly report or document these items, so I decided to preserve them for the future. Below the text was a hand-drawn map showing landmarks, compass directions, and exact measurements from various reference points. But what really got my attention was a black and white photograph paperclipped to the page, a young Arlen in his dress uniform, standing next to a massive oak tree that had clearly been struck by lightning. The map was incredibly detailed, showing not just a tree but also a stone fence, a creek bed, and what looked like the remains of an old barn foundation. Arlen had even noted the GPS coordinates. Though GPS didn't exist when he made the map, he must have added those later. I sat there on his bedroom floor, staring at this photograph and trying to process what I was looking at. This wasn't just some sentimental keepsake. This was a treasure map drawn by a World War II veteran who'd apparently hidden valuable items and never retrieved them. From the living room, I could hear Sarah complaining about having to go through all of her father's old papers. She kept saying things like, "Why did he keep all this stuff? And none of this is worth anything." If only she knew what I was holding in my hands. I carefully removed the photograph and the map page, then closed the notebook. Something told me I needed to keep this discovery to myself, at least for now. Call it intuition. Call it respect for Arlen's memory. But I knew that if Sarah found out about this, she'd turn it into some kind of legal battle or media circus. As I was getting ready to leave with a box of Arlen's military memorabilia, Sarah made one last comment that really got under my skin. She said she hoped I understood that this stuff was just sentimental value, that there wasn't anything actually valuable in her father's belongings. She said it with this condescending smile, like she was protecting me from getting my hopes up. I just nodded and thanked her for letting me take the items. But as I drove home with that notebook sitting on my passenger seat, I couldn't stop thinking about what Arlen had written. What if this wasn't just the rambling of an old man? What if there really was something buried on that farm in West Virginia? That night, I spread the map out on my kitchen table and studied every detail. The landmarks were specific enough that someone could potentially find this location, but vague enough that it would take some serious detective work. I kept staring at that photograph of young Arlen, thinking about everything this man had been through, everything he'd seen and done. One thing was certain. Arlen Rhodes had trusted me with something his own family would never understand or appreciate. The question was, what was I going to do about it? For 2 months, that notebook sat at my desk drawer like it was radioactive. Every time I looked at it, I felt like I was betraying Arlen's trust by not acting on his final message. But at the same time, the whole thing seemed completely insane. Was I really going to drive to West Virginia to dig around some stranger's property looking for buried treasure based on a map drawn by a 97-year-old man? But the photograph kept haunting me. That lightning split oak tree was so distinctive, so specific, that I started researching West Virginia farms online during my lunch breaks at Home Depot. I spent hours on Google Earth, scanning satellite images, and looking for properties that matched Arlen's description. Finally, in early January, I couldn't take it anymore. I requested a week of vacation time and decided to drive to West Virginia. If nothing else, I could visit the area and maybe find some closure about Arlen's story. I told myself I was just being a good friend, following up on his final wishes, even if those wishes seemed completely far-fetched. The drive took about 4 hours through some beautiful mountain country. I had printed out several potential locations based on my online research, and my plan was to drive around and see if any of them matched the landmarks in Arlen's map. I figured I'd spend a couple days exploring, take some photos, and head home with a good story about my crazy treasure hunting adventure. The third property I visited was a rundown farm about 20 miles outside of a tiny town called Cedar Springs. The main farmhouse looked like it hadn't been occupied in years, with boarded-up windows and a sagging front porch. But as I drove up the gravel driveway, my heart started pounding. There, about 200 yards from the house, was the most distinctive oak tree I'd ever seen. This thing was massive, probably 8 feet in diameter, and it had clearly been struck by lightning at some point. The trunk was split right down the middle, creating this dramatic V-shape that matched Arlen's photograph perfectly. I parked my car and walked over to the tree, pulling out the old photo to compare. It was the same tree, no doubt about it. The split was identical. The overall shape was right. Even the smaller trees around it seemed to match the background in Arlen's picture. I was standing in the exact spot where that young soldier had posed more than 70 years ago. A pickup truck came rumbling up the driveway, and this grizzled farmer in coveralls got out to see what I was doing on his property. His name was Earl Hutchins, and he'd owned this land for about 15 years after buying it from some family in Pennsylvania. He was suspicious at first, but when I showed him Arlen's photograph and explained the situation, his whole demeanor changed. Earl turned out to be a veteran himself. Served in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, and he had nothing but respect for World War II soldiers. When I told him about Arlen's map and the possibility that something might be buried on his property, he was fascinated rather than angry. He said he'd always wondered about some of the old stories connected to this place. We spent an hour walking around the property, comparing landmarks on the map to what we could see on the ground. The stone fence was still there, though partially collapsed. The creek bed had shifted over the decades, but you could still trace its original path. Even the old barn foundation was visible if you knew where to look. Earl agreed to let me bring in some equipment to search the area, but he wanted to be involved in whatever we found. He said it was his land now, but he respected the veteran connection, and we could work out some kind of agreement if there was actually anything there. Honestly, I think he was just curious to see if this crazy story was true. I drove back home and spent the next week researching metal detection services and ground-penetrating radar companies. This was getting expensive fast, but I couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about Arlen sitting alone in that apartment, knowing his family didn't care about his stories or his service. If he'd left something behind, I was going to find it. 2 weeks later, I returned to Earl's farm with a professional surveyor named Mike and a guy called Danny who specialized in metal detection and recovery. These weren't treasure hunters or amateur hobbyists. They were legitimate professionals who worked with archaeologists and historical societies. I'd explained the situation honestly, and they were intrigued by the historical angle. We started with a surveyor, using GPS equipment to pinpoint the exact coordinates from Arlen's map. The old soldier had been remarkably accurate. His measurements were off by less than 10 feet, which was incredible considering he'd done this work in 1945 without modern technology. Danny fired up his high-end metal detector and started working in a grid pattern around the oak tree. For the first day, we found nothing but old nails, beer cans, and what looked like pieces of farming equipment. I was starting to feel like an idiot, wondering if I dragged these guys out here on a wild goose chase. But on the second day, around 2 in the afternoon, Danny's equipment started going crazy about 15 feet from the base of the oak tree. The readings were strong and consistent, indicating something metallic buried about 3 feet down. Earl brought over a backhoe he used for farm work, and we carefully started digging. At exactly 2 feet and 8 inches down, the backhoe bucket hit something solid. We switched to hand tools and carefully excavated around what turned out to be a military surplus ammo box, the kind used to store artillery shells. The thing was wrapped in what looked like a waterproof tarp and sealed with some kind of wax compound. My hands were shaking as we lifted the box out of the ground. It was heavier than expected, maybe 40 pounds, and you could hear things moving around inside when we carried it. Earl suggested we take it to his kitchen table, where we'd have better light and a clean surface to work on. The box opened with some effort. The hinges were corroded, but the waterproof seal had held perfectly. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and military-issue canvas, were items that took my breath away. First with medals, a silver star, a purple heart, a bronze star with V device, and several others I didn't immediately recognize. But that was just the beginning. Underneath the medals were carefully wrapped packages of stamps, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some were German, some American, some from countries I'd never heard of. Many were clearly from the World War II era, and they looked like they were in perfect condition. At the bottom of the box were 4 small gold bars, each about the size of a smartphone, but much thicker. They had German markings on them, and later research would show they were Nazi gold that Arlen had somehow acquired during the liberation of Germany. Everything was documented with little handwritten cards explaining where each item came from. Danny, who'd seen a lot of recovered items in his career, was practically speechless. He kept saying this was the most significant World War II cache he'd ever encountered. Earl was amazed that this stuff had been sitting under his oak tree for decades while he farmed around it. We drove straight to a bank in Charleston and rented a safety deposit box to store everything while I figured out what to do next. I called military memorabilia expert I'd found online, and when I described what we'd found, he insisted on seeing everything in person. Dr. Patricia Wells was a historian who specialized in World War II artifacts and also did appraisals for insurance companies. When she examined Arlen's cache the following week, her reaction was immediate and dramatic. The medals alone were worth tens of thousands of dollars because of their provenance and condition, but the stamps were the real treasure. Dr. Wells identified several that were extremely rare, including some German occupation stamps and a few American errors that collectors would pay huge money for. The gold bars were legitimate, probably worth around $200,000 just for their precious metal content, but potentially much more to collectors interested in recovered Nazi gold with proper documentation. Dr. Wells' preliminary estimate for the entire collection was between $2 and $2.5 million, possibly more if we found the right buyers and auction houses. She said Arlen had essentially created a perfect time capsule of World War II memorabilia. I sat in her office, staring at this estimate, trying to process what had just happened. 3 months ago, I was making $12 an hour at Home Depot. Now I was potentially a millionaire because a lonely old veteran had trusted me with his final secret. But even as I drove home with Dr. Wells' appraisal report, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of the story, not the end. Arlen's family had made it clear what they thought of his military service and his belongings. What would they say when they found out what I discovered? I should have known Sarah would find out eventually. Small towns talk, and when word got around that someone had found buried treasure on Earl's farm, it didn't take long for the story to make its way back to her. The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 month after we discovered Arlen's cache, when a certified letter arrived at my apartment. It was from a law firm in Richmond, Castleman, Boyd and Associates, representing Sarah Mitchell, formerly Rhodes, and her family. The letter was formal legal language, but the message was crystal clear. They were claiming that anything Arlen had buried belonged to his estate, and therefore to them as his legal heirs. The letter accused me of taking advantage of an elderly man with diminished mental capacity, of manipulating him into revealing the location of valuable family property, and of essentially stealing their inheritance. They demanded that I turn over all items immediately and provide a full accounting of any sales or transactions. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was the same family that called his war memorabilia old junk and nearly threw it all in the garbage. Now, suddenly, they were claiming that Arlen's buried treasure was rightfully theirs, despite the fact that they'd never even known it existed. I called the lawyer whose name was on the letterhead, James Castleman, and tried to explain the situation. I told him about the notebook, about how Arlen had specifically told me where to find it, about how his family had literally given me permission to take his belongings. Castleman wasn't interested in hearing any of that. He said his client had evidence that Arlen suffered from dementia in his final years, that any gifts or transfers he'd made were invalid, and that I'd clearly taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly person. He gave me 48 hours to return everything or face a lawsuit. That night, I went through all of Arlen's things again, looking for anything that might prove he'd intentionally left a notebook for me to find. That's when I remembered something. About 6 months before he died, Arlen had insisted on updating some paperwork with the VA. At the time, I thought it was just bureaucratic stuff, but now I wondered if there was more to it. I drove to the VA office the next morning and asked to speak with Janet, the volunteer coordinator who'd originally assigned me to work with Arlen. She remembered the paperwork update clearly, because Arlen had been very specific about wanting to designate me as his emergency contact and his representative for any VA-related matters. But there was more. Janet pulled out Arlen's file and showed me a letter he'd written to the VA administration, dated just 3 months before his death. In it, he specifically stated that he wanted me to handle his affairs if anything happened to him, and that his family was not to be involved in any decisions regarding his military records or personal effects. Janet made copies of everything and suggested I contact the VA's legal department. She said they'd dealt with similar family disputes before, and they took veterans' wishes very seriously, especially when there was clear documentation. I also remember that Arlen had sometimes recorded our conversations on an old cassette recorder he kept in his living room. He'd said it helped him remember stories he wanted to tell later. I'd never paid much attention to it. But now I wonder if any of those recordings might be useful. I called Rosa, the building manager, and asked if she found any cassette tapes when they cleaned out Arlen's apartment. She said Sarah's family had thrown away boxes of what they called random junk, but Rosa had actually saved some items she thought might be important. The tapes were among them. Rosa let me go through the saved items, and I found dozens of cassette tapes labeled with dates going back several years. I took them home and started listening, hoping to find something that might help my case. On a tape dated just 2 months before Arlen's death, I hit the jackpot. Clear as day, Arlen's voice saying, "I want you to know, If something happened to me, that notebook on my coffee table is yours. My family won't understand what's in it, won't care about the history, but you will. You'll know what to do with what you find. There was more. On another tape, Arlen talked about how he'd never told his family about the items he'd buried, how he'd always planned to retrieve them someday, but never got around to it. He specifically mentioned that he trusted me to handle things properly if he wasn't able to do it himself. Armed with this evidence, I hired my own lawyer, a guy named Rick Patterson who specialized in estate and probate law. Rick listened to the tapes, reviewed all the documentation from the VA, and said we had a strong case. He filed a response to Sarah's lawsuit, arguing that Arlen had made a valid inter vivos gift. That's lawyer talk for giving something away while you're still alive. The case went to court 6 weeks later. Sarah's lawyer painted me as a manipulative caregiver who'd taken advantage of a confused old man. He claimed that Arlen's military service had left him with undiagnosed PTSD and that he wasn't mentally competent to make decisions about valuable property. But Rick was ready for this. He called Dr. Martinez, one of Arlen's VA doctors, who testified that Arlen had been sharp as a tack right up until his death. He'd passed multiple mental competency evaluations and had never shown any signs of dementia or cognitive decline. Then Rick played the cassette tapes. Hearing Arlen's voice in that courtroom, clearly and deliberately explaining his wishes, was powerful stuff. The judge listened carefully as Arlen talked about trusting me with his belongings and his belief that his family wouldn't appreciate their historical significance. Rick also presented the VA documentation showing that Arlen had formally designated me as his representative and testimony from Janet about how insistent Arlen had been about updating his paperwork. We even had Rosa testify about how Sarah's family had treated Arlen's belongings as worthless junk. The judge wasn't impressed with Sarah's case. He pointed out that there was no evidence of mental incapacity, that Arlen had clearly expressed his wishes through multiple channels, and that the family had actually given me permission to take his belongings after his death. His final ruling was brief and to the point. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Rhodes made a valid inter vivos gift to the defendant. The plaintiff's claims of undue influence or mental incapacity are not supported by the facts. The defendant is the rightful owner of all items in question. After the hearing, Sarah approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was furious, her face red with anger, and she got right up close to me before speaking. She said she hoped the money wouldn't bring me any peace, that I had taken advantage of a broken old man who didn't know any better. She said Arlen had been damaged by the war, that he'd never been the same after he came back, and that I was just another person who'd exploited his weaknesses. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that Arlen had been one of the strongest people I'd ever met, that his only weakness was loving a family that didn't love him back. But I didn't say anything. There was no point in arguing with someone who'd never understood her father while he was alive. What really got to me was her final comment. She said that all the money in the world wouldn't change the fact that I was just a nobody who'd gotten lucky by befriending a confused veteran. She said Arlen's real legacy was the family he'd raised and supported, not some buried treasure he'd hidden from the people who mattered. I just stood there and watched her walk away, knowing that she'd never understand what her father had really been. Arlen Rhodes wasn't broken or confused. He was a hero who'd been forgotten by the people who should have honored him most. And in the end, he'd found a way to make sure his story wouldn't die with him. The legal battle was over. But I knew this was just the beginning of fulfilling the promise I'd made to a lonely old soldier who trusted me with his most precious secrets. After the court case ended, I spent weeks staring at Dr. Wells' appraisal report, trying to figure out what Arlen would have wanted me to do with his treasure. I could have sold everything and lived comfortably for life. But every time I thought about cashing in, I heard his voice on those cassette tapes, talking about preserving history and honoring the men who didn't make a home. The answer came during one of our old Tuesday morning drives, a route I still took to think. I drove past the VA center where I'd first met Arlen, past his old apartment, past the cemetery where he was buried in that back corner plot. That's when I realized what needed to happen. I contacted Dr. Wells and sold about 60% of the stamp collection and half the gold bars. The sales brought in just over $1.8 million after taxes, more money than I'd ever imagined having. With that money, I found a small building in downtown Richmond, 3 blocks from the VA Medical Center. It had been a hardware store that went out of business, with big windows and enough space for what I had in mind. I bought it outright and spent 6 months converting it into something Arlen would have been proud of. The Arlen J. Rhodes Memorial Center for Forgotten Veterans opened on June 6, 2021, exactly 77 years after D-Day. The front window displayed Arlen's medals in a beautiful oak case, along with a photograph of him standing next to that lightning-split tree. Above the display was a simple plaque, "For every hero who came home to silence." Inside, we had comfortable seating areas, a small military history library, and a resource center where volunteers help with VA paperwork. But the heart of the center was a story wall. Dozens of photographs and biographies of local veterans whose families had donated their memorabilia and memories. We started with just Arlen's story, but word spread quickly. Within 6 months, we had stories from Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I quit Home Depot and ran the center full-time, using Arlen's money to keep it operating. We offered free services, disability claims help, job placement, counseling referrals, and just a place where veterans could hang out without being forgotten. The most popular program was our Thursday morning coffee gatherings, where older veterans told stories to younger ones. Guys who felt isolated suddenly had an audience that understood what they'd been through. About 8 months after opening, I got an unexpected call from Kyle, Sarah's son, Arlen's great-grandson. He was 19 now, in college, and said he'd been thinking about his great-grandfather since the court case. When Kyle visited, I barely recognized him. Gone was the sullen teenager who'd ignored Arlen's funeral. This was a young man who'd clearly been thinking about his family and heritage. He'd been researching his great-grandfather's military service for a history class, learning things about D-Day he'd never known. Kyle apologized for how his family had treated Arlen and me. He said his mother was still angry about the money, but he was starting to understand what his great-grandfather had really been like. I gave Kyle a tour, showing him his great-grandfather's display. When we reached the story wall, Kyle stopped in front of a photograph of a young Marine from Iraq who'd struggled with PTSD and homelessness before finding support through our programs. Kyle said something that really got to me. Great-grandpa never got help when he came home, did he? Nobody understood what he'd been through. That summer, Kyle volunteered at the center 3 days a week. He was great with the older veterans, respectful and genuinely interested in their stories. Watching him interact with these men, I could see glimpses of Arlen's influence. The same curiosity, the same respectful attention. 2 years later, Kyle graduated with a history degree and decided to pursue military history. He told me that working at the center had changed his entire perspective on what he wanted to do with his life. The center now serves over 200 veterans and their families. We've expanded into the building next door with a full-time counselor, job placement specialist, and 30 regular volunteers. Behind the building, we have a memorial garden with a granite monument listing local veterans who've passed away, including Arlen J. Rhodes at the very top. Every Tuesday morning, I still take that drive past Arlen's old places. But now, instead of ending up sad about a forgotten old man, I drive to our center and see veterans helping other veterans, sharing stories, finding support they need. Last month, I received a letter from Dr. Kyle Mitchell, who just finished his PhD dissertation on post-war veteran reintegration. He dedicated his research to my great-grandfather, Arlen J. Rhodes, and all the veterans whose stories we almost lost to silence. At the bottom, Kyle had written, "Thank you for listening to Great-Grandpa when his own family wouldn't, and for making sure his memory became a gift to other veterans instead of just a legal battle."